clearly articulated and clearly implemented. And the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have a duty to the country to correct the mistakes that have been foisted on the public of Barbados in this budget. But if that were the only one, you might even say, well, it's a mistake. But when mistakes now become habitual, then it leads to the issue of incompetence. And I will deal with that separately. But what's the second mistake? The second mistake was identified by no less a person than the minister's colleague, Minister Don Willinis, who indicated that the solid waste municipal tax at a rate of 0.7% is a mistake. Now, I find it strange that something which is a mistake cannot be corrected in the last 2 weeks since he identified the mistake. And it is because it is not a mistake. It is a decision to reverse and change the rate after the outcry by Barbadians across the board that this tax is too onerous. Because the one thing about a land tax, any tax that is based on value of land, is that it does not depend, it does not take into account whether people have cash or not to pay. So that what they have realized is that the 0.7% tax will lead to the collection of over $170 million as compared to the $49.3 million that the minister in his grid again projected. And therefore there has to be a serious reduction of the tax by more than half in order for the government not to literally cause people to have their properties put at risk for non-payment of too onerous a tax to carry. Now, this equally has now become the law for the next 4 months. There's a problem, though, that there is no statutory authority for the Commissioner of Land Tax to collect anything called a solid waste municipal tax. So this has problems both in terms of rate as well as legal authority for land tax to collect something that is not peculiar to the operations of the land tax department. This has nothing to do with land tax. This is a solid waste tax. Solid waste tax cannot be collected by the Commissioner of Land Tax because the minister says so without appropriate statutory authority. But the reason why I'm saying they have time to make this change, because this does not come into play before October 15th. They do not have time to correct the consolidation tax. But in both instances, if you are in a position where you have to recall Parliament, then because the second tax, even though not immediately applicable, is causing people many a sleepless night. And many people, both at the bottom and the top, there are people who have not paid land tax in this country for years, who will now be brought back into the tax net, and I'm talking about owners of tenantry lands. There are pensioners who get a 50% rebate on land tax, who will get no such rebate on the solid waste tax that they have to pay. There are hotels who are supposed to be at the front line of bringing growth back to this economy, and hence the reduction of their fixed expenses is critical. They will also not get the benefit of the 50% rebate that is applicable here, and therefore you undermine the very platform for growth that you need to get Barbados out of this. And then there are ordinary people who, because you first $190,000 of value is excluded in computing land tax, would pay a lesser amount naturally for the most part. So that on these fiscal measures, the government has a duty to bring back confidence and to remove fear by recalling Parliament and clarifying what was the purpose and intent of these fiscal measures, because it cannot be done by a newspaper ad, a newspaper story, whether the ad comes from the Commissioner of Inland Revenue or whether the story comes from Minister Don Willinis. And we have given the government 3 weeks to be able to bring clarity but this is now the first week of September, and people will have to start preparing payrolls within another 2 weeks or so in order to pay. Most people in Barbados are paid anywhere between the 23rd and the 30th of September, their salaries. The second point of confusion that has led to panic and fear in the country has been what has been transparent in relation to workers in the public service and in statutory corporations. There can be no doubt that thousands of workers were affected in the last few weeks by inability to receive pay. There can be no doubt that workers at the Water Authority and the General Post Office have been sent home, and that there have been others who have been told internally in their departments across government ministries that they have to revert simply because they were acting for somebody who will no longer be allowed to act. There can equally be no doubt that the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs issued a circular on the 26th of August 2013, accompanied by a circular issued also by the Permanent Secretary acting in the Ministry of Civil Service, of the same date, 26 August 2013, instructing government departments that they are expected to reduce expenditure in other personal emoluments, namely temporary staff, acting allowances, and substitutes, by 10% this year, which between now and the end of March is $19.5 million, and then in 2014-2015, $30.5 million more in reductions. There can be no doubt, and this is effectively what the minister would have announced in his grid, but we have gone beyond the stage of announcement to implementation. Because the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, when he writes to permanent secretaries and heads of department, they have no latitude to ignore his instructions. Similarly, when the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Civil Service, acting though he is, writes to departments, they have no latitude to ignore. So that the notion that this was a computer glitch, that now becomes a different problem in August from what the problem is today, as reported, I think, by one Mike King in today's paper, as being the language of the Prime Minister, is one that befuddles and causes absolute confusion, because the underlying problem for August and today is the same problem, that the government has no money to pay its public servants, its temporary workers. And insufficient funds to pay them led to people in August not getting paid, as insufficient funds are leading to the decision to cut expenditure by $19.5 million by the end of March, and a further $30 million, $13.5 million next year. The government is not sent home the people at the post office or the Water Authority because they don't like them. They haven't sent them home because they don't like them. They've sent them home because there are insufficient funds. And there were insufficient funds in August, as there are insufficient funds today. What the true story is this: that for the Prime Minister to now say that there will be continued dialogue and that there will be actions taken to assess what is the real impact of a 10% cut after an announcement in a budget and after circulars are delivered to every government department from the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs and from the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Civil Service instructing people, is a convenient way to hide the incompetence of this government, because no cabinet ought to approve any measure without understanding the real impact of the measure which it is introducing. This is an unbelievable admission by the Prime Minister of Barbados, that his government and his Minister of Finance have announced measures that they themselves do not understand the impact of, and that they now have to pause and understand them, even though the government functionaries have issued circulars to every single government department and ministry and heads of department. Now, there are some who will believe that this is really to cover the fact that there has been no appropriate criteria and processes set out by the government. I would believe them if they told me that. There are some who will also suggest that there has been no meaningful dialogue with the workers' representatives in a country that has respected trade union and worker representation since 1941. I would believe that, because no government could even attempt to do the kind of things that they are doing in terms of a $50 million adjustment in central government and a $200 million adjustment in statutory boards without serious consultation with the representatives of the workers, the unions, because, as you know, such action would be unacceptable in the private sector. And such action on the part of Line nearly brought this country to a national strike in January of this year, when Line attempted to send home people without the appropriate consultation of the workers' representatives. And what is at stake? Things such as the criteria. Is it last in, first out? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? The Prime Minister has to stop hiding behind language and tuition of the Barbadian people by telling them what the word temporary means, as if Barbadians do not understand the English language, and as if Barbadians don't understand that chief among the temporary workers is the Cabinet of Barbados. It is contemptuous and arrogant to hide behind that kind of language, rather than to speak to people directly and to say to people, these are your circumstances, this is what your government will be doing, this is why your government is doing it, and this is what we expect to come as a result of the actions. Barbadians do not mind making sacrifices if they can see light at the end of the tunnel. But there is no light at the end of the tunnel, and the government is even now admitting that all it has to offer you is darkness. So we need clarity, because I want to remind you of the language of President Roosevelt when the Great Recession started, when Depression started, when he had to address the American people, as he had the wisdom to know that he had to on a regular basis. And he warned people that the only thing we had to fear is fear itself. When a government has an absence of leadership, such that what dominates in the emotions of people is fear and not confidence, then we are sowing the seeds for our own destruction. We can only appeal to the Prime Minister and to this government. Act in a manner to inspire confidence. Recall Parliament and bring clarity to your tax measures. Address the issues of the wages, adjustments, be it through whatever measures you have chosen, and do not fool the people that layoffs in central government is a last option, as the Minister of Finance tried to say on page 57, and this is an important point of his budget, that they would use retrenchment as a last resort, and that was their instruction to line ministries. But what does the memorandum from civil service tell government departments? 13 days later. That, however, where necessary and appropriate, statutory boards are encouraged to explore programs for regulating work hours among staff, since retrenchment should be a last resort. They do not say this in respect of central government, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Housing. They say it only in relation to statutory boards. So that the issue of short week, by this government is being stated up front 13 days later as only applicable to statutory boards and not the central government. Are you with me? You understand, Dale? That while Chris Sinclair said that retrenchment should be a last effort, a last resort for line ministries and statutory boards, Civil Service is acknowledging that it is only a last resort for statutory boards, and that the 50 million in adjustments which has to come for central government cannot rely effectively on short week. In other words, is layoffs for central government. Short week will be applied for statutory boards. And that's what this memorandum effectively underscores and goes beyond. This is the difference between the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Civil Service and the Minister of Finance. Minister of Finance would have you believe that retrenchment will be a last resort for everybody. Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Civil Service is saying that it can only be a last resort for statutory boards. By excluding central government here, he's effectively saying you may consider adjustments for regulating work hours among staff for statutory boards. He's not telling the line ministries that then. We understand the difference between line ministries and statutory boards. And the amount for line ministries is the 50 million. The people who have been complaining thus far, for the most part, are people in line ministries, customs, immigration. You have 46 immigration officers who had not been paid up to last week. You had postmen sent home last week and clerical officers from postal. You had on the very day of the debate in the budget, on the Thursday, on the 15th of August, you had Water Authority people sent home. And all we are saying is, you cannot inspire confidence, or you can't ask people to come on board and walk through this crisis with you when what you leave them with is an atmosphere of confusion and darkness. And you hide behind computer glitch, and you hide behind they're not getting paid in August is a different reason from why they will not get paid in September. They're not getting paid in August has nothing at all to do with the budget. They both have to do with the budget. They both have to do with the fact that the government has insufficient funds to pay the people. So for two reasons, we are saying that this budget has now become a nonsense exercise in terms of implementation. Your tax measure is not clear. How you're implementing now your expenditure measures in terms of the reduction in expenditure has now been a perfect exercise of confusion. And no less a person than the Prime Minister who 2 weeks ago told you that he was the Minister of Civil Service and that there will be no chaos. The only thing that has flowed since then is chaos in the public service. And that is why when I hear today, calm down and no basis for alarm, the truth is the only thing that has flowed again is alarm, because when the Prime Minister speaks to the country via the nation, every single public servant is aware that these memoranda have been sent by the Director of Finance and by the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Civil Service. So who are you inspiring confidence in? Who are you fooling? And I'm saying that what this country faces now is so grim that we are prepared to speak only in a way to enlighten the public. And that is what we are seeking to do here now. And the public must know and must call on the government that it cannot be a lawmaker and a lawbreaker too. It cannot expect people to pay taxes without correcting the tax measures by recalling Parliament. It cannot cause people to go home every night in fear, not knowing whether they're going to be paid and not knowing whether they're going to have a job. Whatever your decision is, take it, explain it to people, give them the rationale, give them the expected outcome. We do not have faith in these measures. We've said so. We've said that we would wait and see, and regrettably, what we are seeing has caused us to believe that we are correct in not having faith. The final point that I want to make is this. The rationale for this budget by the Minister of Finance was to bring down the deficit, cut government spending, increase government revenue, correct? So as not to put pressure on the foreign reserves, and so as not to have problems with the government being able to finance its own deficit, its shortfall. There are some technical matters that regrettably are going to carry us nowhere different from where we were before the budget. In other words, the budgetary measures are not going to improve government situation. And to put it very simply, the government's expenditure is what it approved for this year, $3.876 billion. $3.876 billion. You cannot have budgetary measures that by their own announcement add up only to $88.7 million in cut in expenditure and $36 million in new revenue. And when you look at what they're projecting that these measures will have, all of a sudden, expenditure, instead of being $3.87 billion, this government states in this budget will now be $3.44. Now, not even a primary school child can make this mistake. You cannot subtract $88 million from $3,876 million and get $3,440 million. And what we have learned that the government has done is to use what its expenditure was a year ago, going back to a time that is now long past, that is not reality, and saying that we will end up with a deficit of 5%. This budget is to inspire confidence in the international financial institutions and in the marketplace and in the businesses and households of Barbados. So that if when the end of March comes, the government does not have a deficit of 5.4%, or the government's expenditure is still up in $3.7 billion instead of $3.4 billion, we will be no different from where we were a year ago. It is like you, Mike, knowing that you need to cut your expenditure. You have $1,000, you need to cut it by $100. But instead of using the $1,000 that you know you have to spend, you say, well, last year I spent $500, so let me subtract the 100 from the 500 I spent last year. So you give your mother the impression that you only spent $400 instead of $900. You can't take expenditure from a year ago and subtract cuts from today from that expenditure and say, well, guess what? My expenditure is down. Your expenditure is still up in $3.7 billion. And therefore, the shortfall between what you collect in revenue and what you have to spend is still huge and will not achieve the 5.4% deficit, which he states in this budget, in actual words, is the purpose for the adjustment. That's why we had it. That's why these measures are being inflicted upon the people of Barbados to get us out of this crisis. And while I expect that this may be a little technical for many Barbadians to follow, the fundamental point is this. It will not be too technical for the international financial institutions to follow. And it will not be too technical for the rating agencies to follow. And the issue, therefore, is will they have confidence in this budget, given that the projected deficit cannot be a real deficit, since the government is only cutting its expenditure by $88 million this year, and therefore it cannot drop from 3.8 to 3.4. It would have to cut its expenditure by $400 million to get to 3.4. And to use 2012 figures is as disingenuous as you could possibly get to try to give the impression of regularity and safety. I am prepared to explain that again if necessary, because I know it is technical, and Kerrie might have a better chance at making it political and clearer than I am. Dale, you good? You can't cut 3.8 billion by 88 million and get 3.4. You could put it simple like that. You cannot cut 3.87 billion by 88 million and get 3.4 billion. You would have to be cutting